Hi, welcome back. My name is Eleanor. So it's a bit of an odd week, a bit strange, but I thought I'd take you through, sometimes what my week looks like, the highs and the lows. So I kind of felt that I needed an absolute change from all the hard work because I've been doing a lot of what I call hard work, which is really my passion, that the hard work of reading. But sometimes you need to just read. So I decided to look for some sort of a crime novel, and I was at the my local library, and I saw that there's a German writer called Oliver Bettini, who just came out with the last book in a series. He's a crime writer. It's the last book. It was just translated from the German. And I thought, oh, okay, well, I better read the first one first. And luckily, the library had the first one as well. So it's Zen and the Art of Murder by Oliver Bettini. And when I first started reading it, I thought, oh, this is the answer to my prayers because it's this fantastic setting in rural Germany where there's a lot of snow. There's a Buddhist monk who suddenly appears out of nowhere for no reason. And there is a police officer, a woman who I think is in her 40s, and she's struggling with personal issues, and there's an alcohol problem as well. And she takes this on. So I started reading it and I was intrigued. And the strangest thing happened. I got to I'm so close to the end. I'm on page 260, and the last page is 277. And I just lost all interest. I didn't care what the result was, I didn't care what happened to the protagonist. I just didn't care at all. Which is strange. So I don't know if it's, partly it's, of course, my mood, but also I think it's maybe something about the book. Maybe this was the first book of a series. It's fun to continue and follow this particular policewoman's story. But in any case, it didn't do it for me. I suppose also the theme of the kind of crime it was became clearer and clearer, and it upset me more and more. And then also her struggle with the alcohol was becoming darker and darker, and the whole thing just got more and more real, and I was really looking for fantasy. Anyway, the next thing that happened was that there's a wonderful booktuber I follow called Aaron Fair. He's just fantastic. He's soft spoken, he's a deep thinker. I admire him so much, and he usually reads poetry as well as prose. Well, wouldn't you know it, just really on the same week that I had discussed prose poetry, he discusses prose poetry. Absolute coincidence. And he discusses the Penguin book of the prose poem, and he recommends it as I did. So I'll leave a link to him. Go and have a look, because he also reads aloud one of the prose poems that he admired in this book. It's a translation from the Danish of a new to me poet called Inge Christensen. So I commented, on his channel that I look forward to him talking more about prose poetry. It would be a very interesting video to watch. So I thought I'd mention that. And his enthusiasm, and this is something that I love, one of the many things I love about BookTube, his enthusiasm brought me back to read more of the prose poems in this Penguin book of the prose poem, and pushed me to feel that yes, there is a community of people, of readers who appreciate prose poems. There is this this environment where you don't have to prove your worth. You don't have to prove that it's a poem. You don't have to discuss the definition of prose poetry, that it's quite all right to just call it whatever and like whatever. I needed a little bit of that freedom because I often get caught up in definitions, as you probably know from if you followed me for any length of time. I really like following rules. And part of my challenge here is to try to steer my way away from rules. As I say this, I know that I'm about to go into a discussion of more definitions of prose poetry, and also into a very, very interesting article that I revisited this past week on the Petrarchan sonnet. And that's thanks again to another booktuber, the Linguist's Library. But let me first start with number one, then I'll go into number two. Now this is like sneak preview of upcoming attractions, and here they are. Okay, so as far as the prose poetry, I by chance discovered when I was looking for something else that there is an interview on YouTube of Sean Singer, who is the poet that I quoted a little bit from in the previous video, the poet whose latest book, Today in the Taxi, is prose poetry. And he said so many interesting and illuminating things in this video. I'll link it, and if you're doing the washing up or the ironing, or you're mowing the lawn and you're listening to something, this is a good one to listen to. I wrote down a few things he said about prose poetry because I find them helpful. And again, here we go with definitions again, but that's my personality. So first of all, it's he says it's the phrase prose poetry, or the label, is a contradiction in and of itself. So, and by embracing that, he said, you can therefore enhance juxtapositions and contradictions. So if you have in mind a poem that has contradictions in it, why not choose a form that is a contradiction in and of itself? One of his contradictions that he was dealing with within his poems, within that book, is that he has non-fiction observations which he wants to commingle with lyric and what he calls more passionate syntax. And what made me sit up and rewind to that bit is that the interviewer says, now wait a minute, each of your poems has that narrative bit at the beginning that describes something that happened while you were driving your taxi. Are they all exactly things that happened to you, absolutely true, or did you bring fiction in? And so help me, Sean Singer says, I'm telling you, these stories are 100% non-fiction. And if you read his book, your jaw will drop, because it's astonishing to think of the different people and the different situations that he came across just by driving a taxi around New York. And this also made me think about the idea of poetry being neither fiction nor non-fiction. And that's just something interesting that I like to ponder sometimes. So there's that. He also reminded me of something which I can't remember if I mentioned in the previous video, but the connection prose poetry has to the city. And it's going back to Baudelaire. It's going back to the fact that it's a form that allows you to discuss the city in a specific way, but it's also a form that's born of the city. And that's also something to ponder. He says at around the 11, 12-minute mark, he says this, listen to this. Prose is about taking things apart, that is, analysis, while poetry is putting things together, that is, metaphor. Love that. Again, none of these are my words, none of these are my thoughts. All Sean Singer, the interview is linked. Then he says something mysterious, and when a poet says something mysterious about the writing of poetry, I always pay attention, I always write it down. Poems are metabolic and metamorphic. And I believe, if I understood correctly, he was talking about the actual writing of them and the experience of the poet as they are writing. There's something mysterious, supernatural, spiritual about the writing of poetry, and he's trying to put his finger on it, and I really, really appreciate it. Lastly, I told you it's an embarrassment of riches, this interview. At around the 15-minute mark, he points to the idea of a seesaw that's going up and down. On one side, you have straight sense, communication. You want to communicate something to the reader, you have to use straight sense to get exactly what you want through. On the other end of the seesaw, he calls it music or internal thinking, which is not straight sense and a very, very different kind of communication. And when you have a poem, you're really teetering back and forth, and sometimes a poem will be like this, and sometimes a poem will be like this, depending on, the poet. I thought that was very refreshing to reframe the really dull discussion about poetry either being accessible or not, or difficult or not. I think seeing the seesaw as an image is helpful, at least it is for me. So I'm listening to him, thinking about all of this. And then I'm going back to the idea of nonfiction. What is fiction? What is nonfiction? And how do those two combine? And before I talk about the Petrarchan sonnet, Emily from Linguist Library, I'm coming to the Petrarchan sonnet. Before that, I want to talk about a novel I just read during this time. So I should say that before I went to the library and got Zen and the Art of Murder, I also went to the library was it at the same time? I think it was a few days before I got that one. I went to the same library and I looked for what novels they have by Isaac Bashevis Singer, because if you remember, if you're following along, I think it was in the last video that I spoke about how I read The Magician of Lublin, which happens to be on my shelf. And I really enjoyed it. It was a very surprising read for me, finally. I had to push through it at first. And the one novel they had readily available in the library was Enemies, a Love Story. And because it was relatively short, it's about 200 pages, and it's a Penguin modern classic, I thought, oh, okay, that's a good one. And what happened to me, and again, this was before I decided I need the the crime in my life, I was hooked on this book from the very first page, It's a page turner. It's a true pleasure of a novel. But I'm holding myself back from even saying that because it discusses the aftermath of the Holocaust, the aftermath of World War II. It's set in New York and in the, I believe, late 40s. And it follows the protagonist who is a, a Holocaust survivor. He was in Warsaw at the time. His wife and 2 children were on holiday when he had to go and hide, and he was hidden in the barn of his family's maid's farm. And he was hiding there for years. He finally comes to New York with her, having ended up marrying her, believing that his wife and children had perished in the Holocaust. And this is the story of him living with her and his affair with another woman. And then what happens when he sees a notice in the local Yiddish paper to say that they're looking for him because his wife has been found alive and has arrived in New York as well. So you have Manhattan post-World War II. You have a man who is juggling these 3 women, each of which has gone through an unbearable experience that is only hinted at within a community in Manhattan of many other Holocaust survivors. So the whole setting feels like the most unexpected combination of fiction and non-fiction, because it's not a documentary. It's not as if you're going to find yourself in the midst of trauma as we know it, as it's written today. So in 2024, I don't know if anyone ever would be writing this. I feel that there's a certain trend for the past few years. I mean, I've definitely noticed it in poetry, where you embrace whatever traumatic experience you've had in your life, whatever it is. You're not going to find much comedy in that. It's going to feel more like nonfiction. And even if it's autofiction, it's not because there's going to be some lightness to it. At least that's not what I found. This book is entertaining from beginning to end without giving up for 1 second the horror and the truth of these people's experience. And in so doing, it brought me, the reader, to what I feel is a truer understanding of really what surviving trauma can do to a person. And Isaac Bashevis Singer has done this, I believe, primarily because he's able to show that a survivor still has personality, feelings, thoughts, quirks, positive attributes, negative attributes. they're still there. The person is still there. So I'll give you an example. The protagonist here was not in a happy marriage when war broke out, when the truth of the Holocaust began. He was having issues in his marriage, as you do. So later, when his wife comes back and he realizes, unbelievably, that she has survived as well, it's not as if everything that happened between them back then is erased. It's still there. If he has certain dreams of love, if he has certain dreams of relationships with women, his sexuality, all of those are not erased by the trauma he's had. Of course, things change, but fundamentally, he's the same person. And Isaac Bashevis Singer does this so seamlessly. It is a dark comedy, but I was consistently surprised at how that balance remained throughout the novel, so that I never lost hope, just as these people perhaps never lost hope. I'm going to stop there because it's a complex story. And in Isaac Bashevis Singer's author's note, he does mention he himself was not a Holocaust survivor. He came out of Poland to New York prior to World War II. So he does say that he mentions that in his foreword, and he says, this is by no means the story of the typical refugee, his life and struggle. Like most of my fictional works, this book presents an exceptional case with unique heroes and a unique combination of events. And then he says this: the characters are not only Nazi victims, but victims of their own personalities and fates, which I think is the most beautiful gift you can give any character in a book, and especially the most beautiful in this kind of book. They are not defined by their victimhood. He says, if they fit into the general picture, it is because the exception is rooted in the rule. As a matter of fact, in literature, the exception is the rule. And I will say that after I read Enemies, a Love Story, I was so moved. I wanted everyone I knew to read it, and I went online, and then I saw that it was actually made into a would you believe it was made into a movie in the 80s? But if you go, I can leave you a link to the trailer. If you go and look at the trailer, it looks like a straight-out comedy. It is not. This book is not a comedy. But did I laugh? Yes. Did I shake my head in wonder at what this protagonist does? Yes. And would I say that it was an uplifting novel in some ways and a harrowing, bleak novel in other ways? Yes. Do I find the blend of it superb? Yes. I'd be very interested in what other people think of it. What was I going to talk about next? Petrarchan sonnets? I'm going to go from, okay, I'm doing it. I'm going from Isaac Bashevis Singer to the Petrarchan sonnet. I'm going to find a segue. I think I've already thought of a segue. I think it actually goes well in a surprising way. Why am I thinking about the Petrarchan sonnet? So I was talking in my previous video about how it's difficult for me to switch from prose to poetry, and I want to get into the habit of reading more poetry, but it's a different way of reading, blah, 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 poor me, boo-hoo. Emily from the Linguist library said in a comment, It's interesting because a lot of people read one Petrarchan sonnet a day. And I think there are exactly the number of sonnets you need, even if it's a leap year, it's a thing. And I thought, this is fantastic. Well, the thing is, I believe that Emily can read it in the original Italian. I cannot. And I do believe that makes a huge difference. And I didn't see myself, after looking through the sonnets, I didn't see myself being able to read one of those every day. The English is just dodgy. It just really is, because you don't have the rhythm, you don't have the rhyme. It's just not the same. But I suddenly remembered a talk that I had the absolute delight to attend. It was really more like a lecture. So several years back, I was visiting in the US, and if any of you are in Manhattan, I highly recommend a visit to Poet's House. It's on the south side. Or look it up, you'll find it. It's beautiful. Since I was there, they had terrible flooding and they had to renovate, but it's reopened now. I'm sure it's as beautiful as it ever was. So while I was visiting New York, they happened to have a talk, and one of the speakers was Monica Youn, and I was in the area and I popped in. And I was stunned at her talk. It was about the Petrarchan sonnet. And I remembered it to this day. And I went back, and sure enough, there is in their archives online, and I'll put in links, they have a recording of her lecture. And they also have a transcript, which I think is not an exact transcript. It might be summarizing it. So I printed it out, and I kind of lived with it for a couple of days. Gosh, I mean, Monica Youn is a poet. I believe she's also a professor. I've read her work and enjoyed it, but this particular lecture is an absolute standout, and it's called Petrarch's Hangover, an Argument in 5 Sonnets. What I'll do is I'll just point you towards it, because for me to summarize it, it won't do it justice. However, I can't help myself. Okay, so she starts this lecture in the most unexpected way. She says, okay, I'm going to start this lecture on the Petrarchan sonnet by talking about James Joyce. Yeah, I am. Why? Because he... at one point had a necklace made for his beloved. I forget her name. His lover, who was later his wife, Nora Barnacle. She calls this possibly the most overdetermined present ever, because he writes a letter along with this necklace that he had commissioned for her. He writes a letter that details every single thing that he put in it. Now, basically, it's to summarize, is a plaque, and on one side of it is written, "When love is away." On the other side is written, "Love is unhappy." So she points out, as he points out in his letter, that when love is away is 4 words, and love is unhappy is 4 words. And there's a turn, you have to turn it. That's the volta, that's the turn. The Petrarchan sonnet depends on a ratio of 8 lines to 6 lines, which is the same as saying 4 words to 3 words. She embroiders this in, she ties all of this in her lecture in the most profound way, as a way of introducing her listener or her reader to what she calls what is the disproportion within a Petrarchan sonnet So basically, you've got 14 lines, and she says a sonnet is not about the 14 lines, and a sonnet is not about the turn. For her, a Petrarchan sonnet is about what she calls the hangover effect. You've got the 8 lines here, and then underneath you have the 6 lines. And she says, think about it like as you would a sculpture. Imagine if it's an 8-kilo sculpture, and underneath it 6 kilo. Now imagine that one is on top of the other. The bottom 6 is always going to be overshadowed by the 8. Always. Let's say you put a hole in them and you put a rod through them and you spin them. The spinning speed is going to be different. And this is the best way to think about this particular kind of sonnet. I think it's the best way to think about form generally, to start with Monica Youn's vision of what a Petrarchan sonnet can do. And she says the hangover from the first 8 lines is the momentum of nostalgia. So you can't forget what you read, even though after you read the first 8 lines, there's a turn and something different happens. You can never totally move on. And she brings this into this idea of time in poetry and time in a poem. And that's exactly what was so intriguing to me in my video before this one. And thank you, Ben from Benjamin Journals. Thank you so much for your comment, because yes, it is the most profoundly moving truth of reading poetry that people don't talk about. And so if you go to listen to her and then to read, I'll leave the links, you'll see that she has several examples. She gives an example from a Petrarchan sonnet, and then she gives 4 other examples coming up to the present day, and shows how each one uses this form for its ability to do that, to switch time. And just as we have memories in real time, we also have the memories and what she calls the momentum of nostalgia in a poem of this form. So I think that's about it. Okay, so thank you very much for listening, if you made it this far. And don't forget, the only real property is the property of the mind. And I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.